my son-in-law called me a burden to my face right at my own dinner table. The worst part. My daughter, the girl I had given everything to, just laughed and agreed. They thought they had finally broken me. They saw a grieving old man who was becoming a problem they needed to manage. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just smiled, poured myself another glass of wine, and agreed that perhaps it was time for a change. They had no idea the change I had in mind. They thought I was the burden they had to carry. They were about to find out I was the foundation they were standing on. And the ground beneath their feet was about to disappear. Before we delve deeper into what truly happened, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments. What's the best lesson you've ever learned about money and family? The scent of rosemary and thyme, usually a comforting embrace, felt like a hollow echo in the vast silence of the house. It was a ghost of a scent, a memory of my late Martha's boisterous Sunday dinners where laughter was the main course and love the ever-present seasoning. Tonight, however, the air was thick with a cloying sweetness, an artificial fragrance that clung to my daughter, Caroline, like a second skin. It was the scent of money, of a life so far removed from the earthy aroma of the garden she once tended with her small, dirt-stained hands. They had just returned from Bali, a business trip, they'd called it. The sun-kissed glow on their skin and the endless stream of photos showcasing infinity pools and exotic cocktails told a different story. I had roasted a chicken, the way Martha used to, stuffed with lemons and herbs from my own garden. It was a peace offering, a prodigal daughter's welcome. Martha's prized china, each plate a story, a memory of a christening, a graduation, a holiday shared, gleamed under the soft light of the chandelier. But the table felt less like a place of communion and more like a stage, set for a performance I had no desire to watch. The tension was a low hum, a discordant note in the symphony of a family dinner. Caroline, my once bright-eyed, endlessly curious daughter, now a stranger in expensive silk, toyed with her food. Her perfectly manicured nails, the color of blood, were a stark contrast to the memory of her small hands, calloused and strong. From the summer she helped me build the deck. I had worked 2 jobs that year to pay for the materials, a sacrifice she had long forgotten if she had ever truly understood it. Sheldon, on the other hand, was in his element. He held his wine glass like a scepter, the ruby liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim with each expansive gesture. He had already consumed 2 glasses of the vintage I had been saving, a bottle Martha and I had purchased on our 25th anniversary, a trip we had saved for a decade to take. He spoke of investments and portfolios, of market trends and leveraged assets, words that were as foreign to me as the life he had built for my daughter. A life I had, ironically, financed. "You know, Mark," he began, his voice slick with a condescending familiarity that always set my teeth on edge, "you're a real piece of work." A smug grin stretched across his face, a mask of bonhomie that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Still mowing your own lawn, I see. A man of your age, and this house." He gestured vaguely, a dismissive wave of his hand that encompassed not just the room, but the life Martha and I had built within its walls. "It's a bit much for one person, don't you think? All this space." He made it sound like an affliction, a disease of emptiness. "It's time you considered a more suitable place, something more manageable." Manageable. The word hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, the familiar ache of disappointment that had become my constant companion since Martha's passing. I looked at Caroline, a silent plea in my eyes. I saw a flicker of something, a ghost of the girl who used to defend me against schoolyard bullies, but it was extinguished as quickly as it appeared. A giggle escaped her lips, a sound so brittle and hollow it sent a shiver down my spine. "Oh, Sheldon, be nice," she chided. But her eyes, my eyes, the eyes I had once seen reflected in the mirror, danced with a cruel amusement. "But he's right, Dad. You are a bit set in your ways, living all alone in this big house. We worry about you." Worry. A word they wielded like a weapon, a convenient excuse for their own self-interest. They worried about my loneliness, yet their visits were as rare as a summer frost. They worried about my finances, yet their hands were always outstretched. I remembered the string of loans that were never repaid, the down payment on their house, the car I had co-signed for, the dreams I had shelved to fund Caroline's ever-changing ambitions. Martha would have seen through them. She had always been the discerning one, the one who could spot a wolf in sheep's clothing from a mile away. "Be careful, Mark," she used to say, her voice a gentle warning. "Our little girl has a champagne taste and a beer budget." I had dismissed it as motherly concern, but now her words echoed in the silence, a haunting premonition. The final, irrevocable blow came with a flourish of drunken bravado. Sheldon, in a grand theatrical gesture to emphasize some trivial point about his portfolio, sent his wine glass tumbling. The deep red liquid bled across the pristine white tablecloth, a stark, violent stain on the carefully constructed illusion of a happy family dinner. It looked like a wound, a mortal blow to the heart of our family. A flicker of annoyance, not remorse, crossed Sheldon's face. He dabbed at his designer shirt with a napkin, a look of disgust on his face, as if the wine, my wine, had dared to soil his expensive attire. "See what I mean?" he huffed, his voice rising in petulant anger. "There's just no space in here. A father needs to know when to step aside to let his children move forward. Dad, you're becoming a burden, a stumbling block in our path." The words, sharp and glittering with a casual cruelty, hung in the air like poisoned darts. I looked at Caroline, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. I saw the words register in her eyes. I saw the flicker of a choice, a crossroads. She could defend me. She could salvage what was left of our fractured relationship. But she chose silence. She averted her gaze, her manicured nails tapping a silent, impatient rhythm on the table. In her silence, I heard her consent. In her averted gaze, I saw her betrayal. In that moment, something within me, a fragile, hopeful thing I hadn't even realized was still alive, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The last stubborn embers of a father's unconditional love for his child grew cold, leaving behind nothing but the bitter ashes of regret. I did not erupt. I did not raise my voice. The anger was a cold, hard thing, a diamond forming under the immense pressure of their entitlement. I simply smiled, a tight, humorless stretch of my lips that did not reach my eyes. "You're right, Sheldon," I said, my voice dangerously calm, the words carefully enunciated. "Perhaps it is time for a change." The change I promised them began not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, deliberate clicks of a mouse. On the first of the month, the day Caroline's generous $2,000 lifestyle allowance was scheduled to transfer. I sat at the mahogany desk Martha had always polished with lemon oil. I opened my online banking portal, navigated to the recurring payments page, and with a sense of profound, icy calm, I clicked delete. One by one, I dismantled the financial scaffolding that had held up their precarious, gilded life. The automatic payment for their utilities, the hefty monthly draft for the mortgage on their 4-bedroom, no-space house. Each click was a small, satisfying snip of a thread in the safety net I had woven for far too long. For the first few days, there was a blissful, telling silence. Caroline, I imagined, was likely too busy curating her online presence or debating the merits of a new handbag to notice the absence of her monthly stipend. The first tremor occurred a week later. My phone buzzed with a text. "Hey Dad, weird cue, but did the transfer go through? My account looks funny." I pictured her, phone in hand, brow furrowed in mild irritation as if I were a faulty ATM. I let the message sit unanswered for several hours before replying with a simple, unhelpful, "Not sure what you mean." The real fun began the following Tuesday. I was in the garden, my hands buried in the cool earth, a feeling of grounding I hadn't experienced in years. When my phone rang, it was Caroline, and her voice was a symphony of indignation. "Dad, the power is out. Sheldon is trying to watch the game and everything just went black. What is going on with the account?" I could almost see them, Sheldon, red-faced and fuming in his leather recliner, deprived of his high-definition sports. Caroline standing in dark, her perfectly applied makeup probably melting in the stuffy, un-air-conditioned house. "The power's out?" I asked, injecting a note of mild fatherly concern into my voice. "Did you check the breaker box?" "Of course I checked the breaker box," she snapped. "This is a blackout in the whole house. Did you forget to pay the bill or something? It's over $500, Dad, you know that." "Ah," I said, pausing as if I were genuinely trying to remember. "That does sound familiar. I'm sure it will come back on eventually." I offered no solution, no promise to call the power company. Just the placid reassurance of a man with no skin in the game. The sputtering on the other end of the line was immensely gratifying. 2 days later, their Wi-Fi died mid-binge watch. The frantic texts about that were even more entertaining. But the main event, the one I knew would truly test their mettle, arrived in a crisp, windowed envelope with a bright red urgent stamp. It was the mortgage notice. I could picture the scene perfectly. Sheldon, the self-proclaimed financial wizard, retrieving the mail from their designer letterbox. His confident swagger faltering as he read the words, "Notice of delinquency and foreclosure proceedings." His text messages began as a single demanding command. "What's going on, Dad?" An hour later, they had escalated. "We have a late notice for the mortgage. A serious one." And finally, as the sun began to set on their perfect manicured world, the all-caps panic. "Mark, call me. This is a $3,500 payment. The bank is threatening legal action. This is unacceptable." I let his calls go to voicemail. I listened to his messages later that evening, a glass of my good, non-Sheldon spilled wine in hand. His voice, usually so full of bluster and arrogance, was tight with a fear he was trying desperately to conceal. It was only then, staring at a pile of angry red envelopes on their granite countertop, that the truth must have finally dawned on them. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't senility. It was a declaration of war. Carolyn called me one last time that week, her voice stripped of its usual whining petulance, replaced by a cold, sharp fury. "You're doing this on purpose," she accused, the words clipped and venomous. "You're cutting us off." "Caroline," I said, my voice as smooth as polished stone, "you and your husband are adults. You told me yourself I was a burden, that it was time for me to step aside. I'm simply taking your advice. It's time for you to move forward on your own." The silence that followed was heavier than any words she could have spoken. I had turned their own insults into the bars of their new cage. The panic and confusion had finally coalesced into a single horrifying realization. The Bank of Dad was officially and permanently closed. Their world, once so effortless and comfortable, was beginning to unravel at the seams, and they had no idea how to sew it back together. They were about to discover that a life built on someone else's foundation is a terribly fragile thing indeed. Their direct assault having failed, they regrouped and opened a new front, one far more insidious and, they must have believed, far more effective. When brute force doesn't work, you poison the well. Their campaign began not as a roar, but as a series of concerned, sorrowful whispers delivered over coffee with Martha's friends and casual chats with neighbors over the fence. I was no longer a father setting boundaries. I was a tragic figure, a man unmoored by grief. The narrative they spun was a masterpiece of manipulative fiction. To my kindly next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gable, whose hydrangeas I had helped save from aphids just last spring, Caroline confided with a tremor in her voice, "We're just so worried. He's not himself. He completely forgot to pay our utility bills. Just let the power get shut off. His memory is getting so spotty." Mrs. Gable's friendly waves across the lawn were replaced by hesitant, pitying smiles, her eyes full of a sorrow that wasn't for me, but for the caricature they had created. To Martha's Bridge Club, a formidable group of women who had been my friends for 30 years, they painted a picture of encroaching paranoia. "He thinks we're after his money," Sheldon would say, shaking his head with a sigh that suggested a heavy, undeserved burden. "He's become so suspicious of everyone. It's heartbreaking to watch." Soon the weekly invitations for poker night, a tradition since before Caroline was born, stopped coming. An old business acquaintance, Bill Peterson, saw me at the hardware store, and instead of his usual firm handshake and questions about the market, he clapped me softly on the shoulder. "Hang in there, Mark," he said, his voice oozing a condescending sympathy. "Grief does strange things to a man." The most cutting rumor, the one that truly twisted the knife, was that I had always been secretly stingy, that Martha had been the generous heart of our marriage. "She was the one who always made sure we were taken care of," Caroline would lament. "Since she's gone, well, his true colors are showing." They were using my love for Martha, my grief for her, as a weapon against me. They were tainting her memory to serve their greed. I observed it all from the quiet solitude of my too-big house. I saw the subtle shifts, the averted gazes, the way conversations would halt when I approached a group. It was infuriating, yes, but more than that, it was predictable. I had built a successful business from the ground up by understanding human nature, and my daughter and her husband were, if nothing else, textbook examples of desperation and entitlement. Their lack of subtlety was almost comical. While they were busy with their amateur theatricals, I was engaged in a far more concrete project. My mahogany desk became my command center. I wasn't just grieving, I was auditing. I spent days in my study, surrounded by 2 decades worth of bank statements and financial records I'd had the foresight to retrieve. The crisp scent of old paper filled the room as I laid them out chronologically. With a yellow highlighter, I began to trace the flow of money, a river of my life's work that had flowed exclusively in one direction. Each highlighted line item was a ghost of a past sacrifice. There was the 5-figure transfer for Caroline's graduate degree in art history and curatorial studies, a passion that lasted exactly 6 months after graduation. The down payment on their house, a sum that would have funded my and Martha's dream trip to see the Northern Lights. I found the receipts for Sheldon's first startup, a disastrous venture into artisanal dog biscuits that ended with me footing the bill for 1,000 pounds of unsold organic kibble. I didn't just collect the data, I curated it. I created a new spreadsheet far more detailed than anything Sheldon had ever seen in his portfolio. It had columns and categories: tuition, housing, automobiles, travel, Sheldon's failed ventures. I scanned receipts, bank transfers, and even old forgiven IOUs. The numbers grew, staggering and undeniable. Then I turned my attention to the more recent evidence. I found the audio file on my phone from that disastrous Sunday dinner. I put on my headphones and listened, not with the raw pain I had felt then, but with the detached focus of a prosecutor preparing for trial. Sheldon's arrogant pronouncement, "Dad, you're becoming a burden," was perfectly clear. But the most damning sound was Caroline's light, complicit laugh that followed. It was the sound of betrayal captured in high-fidelity audio. My plan began to form, a quiet, methodical strategy. This wouldn't be one with whispers or rumors. It would be one with cold, hard, documented facts. I began to compose a guest list. It included Mrs. Gable, Bill Peterson, and the entirety of Martha's Bridge Club. It included Sheldon's primary business partners, men who valued stability and reputation above all else. And of course, the guests of honor, Caroline and Sheldon. The invitation was simple, elegant, and printed on heavy cardstock. It announced a small gathering at my home, a thank you to my friends for their support over the past year. They would see it as a white flag, a sign that their campaign had worked, that the lonely old man was cracking and seeking reconciliation. They would arrive smug and triumphant, ready to accept my surrender. They had no idea they were walking into a courtroom and that I had already prepared a verdict. The night of the party arrived, and with it a perfect clear sky that seemed to mock the storm I was about to unleash. I had spared no expense. The house, far from being the cluttered cavern Sheldon had described, was filled with the warm glow of lamplight, the scent of baked brie and Martha's famous apple pie, and the soft strains of a jazz trio I'd hired for the occasion. It looked like a home, a place of warmth and celebration, the perfect stage for the final act of this family tragedy. They arrived fashionably late, of course, sweeping in with the air of triumphant victors arriving to accept the surrender of a vanquished foe. Caroline, radiant in a new dress that probably cost more than my first car, gave me a kiss on the cheek that was pure performance, a magnanimous gesture for the assembled audience. Sheldon clapped me on the shoulder with a smug warmth, a silent, "All is forgiven" for my recent, inexplicable lapse in judgment. They moved through the room, graciously accepting the condolences of my friends for my recent difficulties, their faces masks of filial concern. I watched them work the crowd, soaking in the pity that was meant for me. Mrs. Gable gave Caroline a comforting hug. Bill Peterson shook Sheldon's hand, giving him a knowing, man-to-man look of sympathy. It was perfect. They were sealing their own fate with every sorrowful nod and deceptive sigh. After an hour of pleasantries, when the wine had flowed freely and the mood was comfortably relaxed, I stepped to the center of the living room and tapped a crystal glass with a spoon. The gentle chime cut through the soft chatter, drawing all eyes to me. "Friends, neighbors," I began, my voice steady and clear. "Thank you all for coming. It means the world to me. I know there's been some concern for me lately. Some talk of my state of mind, my memory." I paused, letting my eyes drift over the crowd before landing on Caroline and Sheldon. They stood with beatific smiles, ready for my public apology. "I understand there's been some confusion," I continued, "and I wanted to take this opportunity to clear the air, to provide some clarity." With a small remote in my hand, I clicked a button. The large television screen mounted above the fireplace, which had been displaying a slideshow of Martha's garden, flickered to life. There was a moment of confusion among the guests. Then the screen was filled not with a family photo, but with the crisp, unmistakable lines of a spreadsheet. My spreadsheet. The room fell silent, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator. I gestured to the screen, my voice calm, almost conversational. "I've been accused of being forgetful lately, and perhaps that's true, so I took the liberty of refreshing my memory. We can start with Caroline's very brief but very expensive passion for art history. That little 6-month intellectual journey cost a mere $54,000, a sound investment in her future, I'm sure you'll agree. And we mustn't forget Sheldon's brilliant foray into the world of artisanal dog biscuits, a visionary enterprise that cost me a $25,000 loan that, much like the biscuits themselves, was never seen again. Of course, I said, my voice softening with a theatrical sadness. There was the down payment on their lovely home, the one with no space. $150,000, a sum Martha and I had earmarked for a trip to see the Northern Lights. But some dreams, it seems, are more important than others. The numbers continued to paint a picture for the silent room. There was the luxury car I co-signed for, a necessary expense for a man of Sheldon's stature. That was another $18,500 just to get it out of the dealership. Then there was the simple 5-year-long matter of a $2,000 a month lifestyle allowance to keep them afloat, which comes to a tidy $120,000. And most recently, their business trip to Bali, which according to my records set me back just under $13,000. When you add it all up, the grand total of my burden comes to a figure that I myself found quite memorable. I saw the color drain from Caroline's cheeks, her perfectly painted smile frozen in a rictus of horror. Her hand flew to her mouth. Sheldon's face went from smug to confused to a dark, mottled red. "What is this?" he hissed, taking a step forward. "Mark, turn this off. This is a private family matter." But no one was listening to him. Every eye in the room was glued to the screen. I saw Mrs. Gable's jaw drop. I saw Bill Peterson lean forward, his brow furrowed, as if auditing the numbers himself. Martha's bridge club, a jury of formidable women, exchanged sharp, knowing glances. The pity they had felt for me was rapidly curdling into something else entirely. As the final staggering total, a number well into 7 figures, hung in the air, I let the silence stretch for a beat. Then I clicked the remote again. "And for those of you concerned about my psychological state," I said calmly, "I offer this." Sheldon's voice, slick with wine and arrogance, suddenly filled the silent room from the high-quality speakers I'd had installed years ago. A father needs to know when to step aside so his children can move forward. Dad, you're becoming a burden, a stumbling block in our path. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. And then, the sound that had shattered my heart, the sound that was the centerpiece of my entire presentation. Caroline's light, tinkling laugh of agreement. If the spreadsheet was a dagger, the audio was the twist. Caroline let out a small, strangled cry, her face crumbling like a porcelain doll dropped on a stone floor. Sheldon was frozen, his mouth agape, the blood draining from his face, leaving him pale and ghastly. He looked at his business partners, who were staring at him with expressions of cold, hard appraisal. Mr. Sterling, Sheldon's senior partner and a man I had known for years, a man who valued reputation above all else, caught my eye. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned his gaze to Sheldon, his face a mask of disappointment and disgust. I clicked the remote one last time, silencing the laughter that echoed in the room. I stood tall, feeling the weight of years of resentment lift from my shoulders. "As you can see," I announced, my voice ringing with a clarity and strength that no one in that room could mistake for senility, "I have been a burden, a very expensive one. And as I've been told it's time for me to step aside, I have decided to take that advice to heart." I looked directly at my daughter and her husband. "The house I bought for you, the one with no space, was sold yesterday. The closing was this morning." A wave of shock rippled through the guests. Caroline swayed, and Sheldon instinctively reached out, not to comfort her, but to steady himself. "The proceeds from the sale," I concluded, delivering the final fatal blow, "along with a significant portion of my remaining estate, are being placed in a trust. That trust will make a sizable annual donation to a local charity that provides housing and financial counseling for families who are truly in need." The polite party atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating cloud of shame and recrimination. Mr. Sterling walked calmly over to Sheldon, his voice low but audible in the stunned silence. Sheldon, my office. Monday morning, don't be late. It was a death sentence delivered in a monotone. He then walked over to me, shook my hand firmly, and said, "Mark, I am so sorry." Mrs. Gable looked at Caroline not with pity but with a quiet, profound disgust before turning her back. The bridge club formed a silent, impenetrable wall of judgment. The whispers started no longer about my supposed decline, but about the breathtaking ingratitude they had just witnessed. Amid the chaos, I saw the first cracks in their union appear. "You did this," Caroline hissed at Sheldon, her voice a venomous whisper. "Your big mouth, you ruined everything." "Me?" he shot back, his face contorted in impotent rage. "You were laughing right along with me." They stood there in the center of the life I had built, a life they had squandered, no longer a power couple but two drowning swimmers pulling each other under in a sea of their own making. And I felt nothing but a cold, quiet, and deeply satisfying sense of justice. The tables had not just been turned, they had been smashed to pieces. The jazz trio packed up their instruments in a silence that was far louder than their music had been. One by one, my guests departed, offering me quiet words of support, their eyes now clear of the pity my children had so carefully cultivated. Soon only Caroline and Sheldon remained, standing like statues in the wreckage of their lives. There was nothing left to say. They left without a word, the front door closing with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot in the sudden quiet. The fallout was swift and merciless. As promised, Mr. Sterling fired Sheldon that Monday. With his reputation in tatters, no one else would touch him. Within a week, a notice to vacate arrived from the new owners of their house. 2 days after that, the luxury car I had co-signed for vanished from their driveway in the pre-dawn hours, leaving nothing but a dark oil stain on the pavement. Their carefully curated world collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. They were forced to move into a cramped 2-room apartment in a dingy building on the other side of town, a place where the walls were paper-thin and the air was thick with the lingering scent of stale cigarettes and boiled cabbage. The designer clothes were sold for pennies on the dollar, replaced by whatever they could find at thrift stores. The lavish dinners were a distant memory, their new diet consisting of instant noodles and day-old bread. The friends who had once flocked to their parties now crossed the street to avoid them. Their phones, once buzzing with invitations and social chatter, fell silent. In the crushing quiet of their new life, there was nowhere to hide from their anger, their fear, and their suffocating loneliness. I heard nothing from them for weeks, and I didn't reach out. A lesson, for it to be truly learned, must be experienced without a safety net. Then one rainy night, as I was reading by the fire, a soft, hesitant knock came at my door. I knew who it was before I opened it. Caroline stood on my porch, drenched and shivering, her face pale and tear-streaked. The expensive silk was gone, replaced by a threadbare coat. The smug entitlement had been washed away, leaving behind a desperate, remorseful woman I hadn't seen in years. "Dad," she sobbed, the word catching in her throat. She didn't ask for money. She didn't make excuses. She just stood there, stripped of all her pretenses. "I'm so sorry. I forgot what it meant to be grateful. I forgot everything you and Mom taught me. I was a terrible daughter." A few days later, Sheldon came. He didn't knock. I found him standing at the end of my driveway, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by the weary posture of a man who had been thoroughly and completely defeated. He looked up, his eyes filled with a shame I never thought him capable of. "Mr. Bennett," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Mark, I apologize for everything." It was a start, a small, cracked foundation upon which something new might be built. It was a start. a small, cracked foundation upon which something new just might be built. I didn't offer them platitudes or false comfort. I simply invited them in from the rain and the cold. We sat in the living room, the same room that had been their courtroom, but the air was different now. Stripped of all pretense, filled only with a heavy, fragile silence. I didn't reach for my checkbook. The bank of Dad was permanently closed for withdrawals, but the main office, the one that dealt in actual fatherly advice, was open for business. I went to my desk and retrieved a small, worn, leather-bound notebook. It was nothing fancy, something I had carried with me for years, filled with the hard-won lessons of a lifetime. Martha used to tease me about it, calling it my book of universal truths. I placed it on the coffee table between them. "Forgiveness isn't a gift I can give you," I said, my voice softer than it had been in a long time. "It's something you have to earn from yourselves, but a second chance that I can offer." I pushed the notebook towards them. "This is more valuable than any money I ever gave you. It has no stock tips, no get-rich-quick schemes. It has the simple, boring math of how to build a life, how to make a budget and stick to it, how to tell the difference between what you want and what you need, how to find dignity in a hard day's work. These are the things Martha and I learned together. This is the only inheritance I have left that matters." Their new life was a brutal education. Carolyn, whose hands had only ever known manicures and designer handbags, got a job as a waitress at a diner. The first few weeks, she would come home with her feet bleeding and her eyes red from crying over rude customers and spilled coffee. Sheldon, who once moved millions with a keystroke, joined a non-union construction crew, hauling drywall and digging trenches under a sun he had previously only experienced from the deck of a resort pool. They were perpetually exhausted, their bodies aching with the unfamiliar strain of physical labor. Their apartment was a constant reminder of how far they had fallen. But in that cramped space, something unexpected began to grow. I saw it during their new Sunday visits. They would arrive not in a luxury car, but on the bus, and they never came empty-handed. Sometimes it was a small apple pie from the supermarket, proudly presented as a product of their meticulously planned grocery budget. Sometimes it was a simple bouquet of daisies. They would sit at my kitchen table, their hands showing the marks of their new lives. Caroline's nails were short and unpolished, her knuckles chapped. Sheldon's hands were calloused and rough. But they held hands now. Not as a pose for others, but as a genuine source of comfort. They didn't talk about their brand or their portfolio. They talked about their small, hard-won victories. "I got a $5 tip from Old Man Hemlock today," Caroline said one afternoon, her eyes shining with a pride she never had when I bought her a $1,000 purse. "He usually just complains." "We paid the electric bill 2 days early this month," Sheldon added, pointing to a line in a small ledger they now carried with them everywhere. "And we still had enough left over for this pie." They would ask questions about the notebook. "Dad, it says here to put 10% of every paycheck into savings, no matter what. But after rent and food, there's barely anything left." "Then you start with 1%, I'd tell them. "You start with $1. The amount doesn't matter as much as the discipline." Our relationship, once built on the shifting sands of financial dependency, was being rebuilt, brick by painful brick, on a new foundation of mutual respect. I was no longer an ATM, I was a father. They were no longer dependents. They were my children, learning, stumbling, but finally standing on their own 2 feet. One Sunday, about a year after their world had imploded, they invited me to their apartment for dinner. The air wasn't filled with the aroma of roasted chicken and thyme, but with the simple, honest scent of spaghetti sauce simmering on the stove. The meal was served on mismatched plates, but the table was set with a care that spoke volumes. We ate and we talked, and for the first time in over a decade, we laughed. A real unburdened laughter that filled the small apartment with a warmth my grand house had been missing for years. As I looked at them, at Caroline, my daughter, whose beauty now came not from a makeup counter but from the strength in her eyes, and at Sheldon, a man humbled and remade by hardship, a profound sense of peace settled over me. The bitter anger had faded, replaced by a quiet, swelling pride. Justice, I realized, wasn't just about punishment. It was about balance. By taking everything from them, I had given them the one thing money could never buy: a chance to discover their own worth. They were still struggling, but they were struggling together. They were building a life, not one of effortless luxury, but one of earned dignity. And that, I thought with a slow, genuine smile, was a legacy Martha would have been truly proud of. They had become truly wealthy, and in witnessing their transformation, so had I. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.